Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. On September 11, 2001, that golden door was left open wide enough to fly a 767 through. It's time America knows why.
Have you ever seen the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the original one, the black and white version, Kevin McCarthy, and 50s movie, you know, and in it, these giant seed pods come down from outer space, right? And they infiltrate this perfect little town called Santa Mira in California. And they sort of get into the basements and they sort of evolve overnight and they take over the bodies of the regular townspeople and they become these soulless, ungodly, lifeless automatons passing themselves off as real human beings. Sort of like communists, you know, it's the 50s, right? Any case, there's only one guy left who's unsnatched by movie's end. His name's Dr. Miles Bennell, and we pick him up. At the end of the movie, he's running out of town, he's desperate, these ungodly little communists are chasing him out of town, and he comes to a highway and he stops and he doesn't know whether to go in or not, and then he decides, he just runs into the highway and he says, stop, you have to listen to me. Now the townspeople are about ready to chase him in, and then the leader kind of pulls them back and he says to them, hey, hang on, let him go. No one will ever believe him. Now you guys, you're the people in the car. You're driving down the highway, your minds are still open, you're willing to listen. You should be skeptical, you see someone out here yelling like that, but your minds are still capable of receiving new information. Now me, you'll forgive me if sometimes I identify with Dr. Miles Bennell. And sometimes I think of the major American media as those ungodly little body snatched people. Their bodies are already gone, their souls are already snatched. They just don't want to let you know. And like Dr. Miles Bennell, I've got a story to tell. It's an oversized story. It's large in its implications, it's epic in its proportions, and it's a little difficult to believe. Had I not been so deeply involved in it myself, had I not met so many of the frontline truth tellers in this story, I wouldn't believe it. But it's pretty simple when you get down to it. One conspiracy, that's all I'm talking about. And it's this, and I can summarize it in a sentence, is that after the electoral debacle of November 1994, the Clinton White House decided that it would do whatever it had to do to retain the presidency, and that meant tailoring every single terrorist investigation to its most advantageous political outcome. It's that simple, it's that logical, and it's that understandable. Let me repeat this. After November 1994, the Clintons tailored every terrorist investigation to its best political outcome. We're talking here Oklahoma City, we're talking Khobar Towers, we're talking about the Olympic Park bombing, we're talking indirectly about the death of Ron Brown, and we're talking perhaps most specifically about TWA Flight 800. Now, I don't claim to know about a whole lot of other conspiracies. I'm just going to talk about this one. But this is a big one. This is a major fix. This is the mother of all fixes. We're going to call it, just for simplicity's sake, let's just call it the mega fix. Now, BCCI, Mina, Lady Di, JFK Jr., Vince Foster, I'll leave those to other people. I don't profess to know which is true and what's not true. I'm going to stick to what I know. But what I'm talking about is so powerful, even though it's simple, and it's so large in its implications, that it has to be talked about. Because what happened, by denying the truth about all of these investigations, by shaming people who even raised the possibility of Islamic terrorism, we left ourselves wide open on September 11th. Now, you're going to be asking yourself this, if everything I say is true, and I think it's a good question because it's a question I ask myself from time to time, how is it that some unknown clown from Kansas City has come to be the literary custodian of the single greatest untold story of our time? Well, that's a good question. That's a strange question. But there are two answers, and I'm going to tell you one right now. Well, You know, the first inspiration for my new career as a reporter is of course, the internet. I mean, right now, and I mean this literally to be true, I have more reportorial power in my $225 office in Kansas City than the New York Times did collectively 10 years ago. I mean that literally true. And I mean, internet stuff, yeah, okay, this kind of stuff the internet stuff, but also real hard data, court reports, government surveys, TV transcripts, journal articles, all kinds of reports, you name it, real hard factual data. And I can download it in a second, I can cross-check it in nanoseconds, and I can find connections that people couldn't find before. For instance, last year, in the year 2003, spring of 2003, I wrote the first article asking that Jamie Gorelick be removed from the 9/11 Commission. Jamie Gorelick was a deputy attorney general under the Clintons. And I saw the conflicts of interest that she had. They were huge. I said, this woman can't be on the commission. I didn't even know how to pronounce her name then. I used to say Gorelick, which sounded better actually than Gorelick. And it took a year before the major media picked up on this. And in fact, the Judiciary Chairman asked that she be removed. I think she stayed on, but she shouldn't have. I also write regularly for WorldNetDaily, which is a very large and influential online journal. And through that, I've met literally hundreds of people, especially when I did my TWA book, First Strike, who, we're talking serious professionals, aviation professionals, engineers from Boeing, mechanics from TWA, pilots, people who work in the munitions industry and the bomb industry, people all throughout the military, all the way up to the rank of admiral. And I get from them real, good, serious information. And the combination of all this stuff gives me a power to report that quite simply is unprecedented in media history. And that's just one advantage I have. You know, the second phenomenon that has given me this career, let's just call it Gingrichophobia, okay? It sounds like, I know, like a gum disease, but it's a real phenomenon. Let's go back to November 1994. In a time of relative peace and prosperity, the Democrats lose an incredible 52 seats in the House, 8 in the Senate. They lose control of both. Mario Cuomo loses the governorship in New York. Tom Foley, the Speaker of the House, loses his congressional seat. Ann Richards in Texas loses to the unknown son of George W. Bush. No, George W. Bush, the unknown son of George H.W. Bush. And the world, the progressive world, is falling apart around them. I mean, not just in New York and Washington, there especially, but even in places like Kansas City. You know, I know something about this because my wife is a dean of a university, so I rub elbows with these people on occasion. And I remember right after that, I went to a Christmas party. No, they don't celebrate Christmas. What do they call it now? Oh, a winter solstice party, all right? And I stumbled into 3 separate conversations, this is literally true, in which the participants were actively comparing Newt Gingrich to Adolf Hitler, okay? Now think about this. Adolf Hitler is a statist, he's a socialist, he's a vegetarian, he's an anti-smoker, right? He hates Jews, he likes leather, and he's particularly fond of boys. Newt Gingrich, anti-statist, anti-socialist, friend of big tobacco, right? Meat eater, friend of Israel, and he likes girls. I know the Republican Party is a big tent, but this is a mighty big tent to encompass these 2 major divergences. Christmas 1994 led me to believe that we're about to witness a perfect storm of disinformation. We had a president and a first lady who were prepared to do whatever they had to do to retain the presidency. And we had a media who were prepared to do whatever they had to do not to notice what the president was doing. And in the next 2 years, there was going to be a whole lot not to notice. Into this perfect storm, into the eye of this storm, stepped me and people like me. That is, we're armed with the internet, and we were prepared to investigate. And, in some ways, I got to thank the major media for the opportunity, because a few years earlier, it would have struck me as impossible that I could be the custodian of such a large story like the Megafix, but here I was. And there are others with me right along with it. Now, one anecdote of this period speaks to the willful blindness, the willful ignorance of so much of the major media. I'm out for a walk one day, and I'm wearing my hat. It says U.S. Park Police. It was given to me by a friend. You get the joke. My neighbor, whom I passed, didn't get the joke. He says, "Hey, Jack, what's with that U.S. Park Police hat?" And I explained to him. I said, "Well, it's Vince Foster, you know how they screwed up his investigation and Park Police did, and it caused this whole big scandal, blah, blah, blah. And he says to me, you know, really kind of, he sniffs at me. He says, "You're not one of those people who believe that Vince Foster was murdered, are you?" And I said, "Well, you know, I've done a fair amount of reading on it, and to me it seems like it's altogether possible that someone did in fact tamper with his body." Now, he just looks at me in disgust. He puts his hands over his ears like this, and he walks away. He literally walks away saying, "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it." Now, what gives this story punch is the profession of my neighbor. He was the publisher of the Kansas City Star. I'm the editor of Business Magazine. We're having a conversation. He doesn't want to hear it. You know, there was an awful lot that my publisher friend and his other media colleagues didn't want to know about in this period. And this included the election that prompted all this skullduggery in the first place. To accommodate their willful ignorance, remember this, Dick Morris, presidential advisor, chose to run $80 million worth of ads everywhere but in New York and Washington. And this way, all those aspiring young Woodwards and Bernsteins could make believe they're not hearing it. "Oh, we don't hear anything, we don't hear anything." And then they could concentrate all of their investigatory zeal on things like George W.'s 25-year-old DUI or his 30-year-old attendance records from the National Guard. Meantime, the megafix just goes right by them. They would also not have to inquire about the funding and where this money was coming from. And this is a real heart of another major scandal. This I document in my book, Ron Brown's Body. We talk about where the money comes from, mainly the People's Republic of China. This could have security implications for years and generations to come, beyond any problem we face right now. Right now, we're just going to deal with the simple, superficial stuff, yeah, like Islamic terrorism and September 11th. And the story picks up in February 1993, when a guy named Ramzi Youssef comes to Jersey City. He's there to help the local whack jobs construct the bomb. They don't know much about it. They call him, in fact, Rashid the Iraqi. That's his nom de guerre. He gets there, works with them. They put the bomb together. It takes some time. There's a lot of work involved in creating a truck bomb. Late February 1993, they drive to New York City. They park their truck under the World Trade Center. They flee the scene. Bomb goes off, and Youssef is disgusted. He had hoped to topple, literally, one building into the next, and when the cyanide in the bomb released to kill a total of 250,000 people. Instead, they only kill 6, they wound hundreds more, but Youssef is disgusted. He leaves that afternoon, gets on a plane, heads back to the Mideast out of JFK. His buddy goes with him, the number 2 guy, goes back to Baghdad, where he stays for the next 10 years until we apprehend him in 10 years later when we invade that unholy city. Now, we pick up again. It's November 1994. It has nothing to do with the election, but Youssef now applies for a visa to the Philippines. A day later, Terry Nichols of Oklahoma City fame gets his visa for the Philippines. Now, when Nichols 2 weeks later leaves for Cebu City, his ex-wife Lana drives him to the airport, and he unnerves her in the car when he says to her, he goes, "If I'm not back in 60 days, take this envelope and open it." Now, she's a little frightened and a little curious, so she opens it before the 60 days, and she finds his insurance policy, she finds his will, and she finds instructions to $20,000 in cash. And this is a little freaky for her. Shortly after that, Ramzi Youssef boards an airplane. This is a Philippine Airlines. And he's got a little practice bomb that he wants to try out. And so what he does is he flies in one stop to Cebu City, just happens to be where Terry Nichols is, gets off, a Japanese tourist gets on, and the bomb goes off, and it kills the tourist and almost brings down the whole plane. And Youssef kind of liked that one. That one kind of worked. Shortly after that, we find Ramzi Youssef back in Manila. He's has a buddy there. He's a Pakistani pilot, and together they're, of course, making new bombs. They have a plan. It's a really diabolical plan. It's called Bojinka. We'll talk more about that later. And then one day, this is like out of a Keystone Cops comedy, the apartment catches on fire. Well, the landlady comes down and she says, hold it, you gotta get out of here. This place is burning down. He says, oh, no, it's no big deal, lady. We're just, cooking in here and things just got out of control. We got this under control. Well, she calls the cops anyhow, and Youssef and his buddy, they flee the apartment. Youssef gets outside, he's down the street, and then he realizes, my God, he goes, I left my laptop back in the apartment. No fool, he sends his partner back in. The Pakistani pilot. Partner goes in, and no sooner does he go in than the police apprehend him and the laptop. They interrogate him, and this guy refuses to break. And then the Filipino police, and this is reported, I don't know this is true, but I like this story anyhow. The Filipino police take 2 of their guys who could pass, and they dress them up as the Mossad. And they come in and they tell the guy, hey, we're going to take you back to Israel. And he says, what do you want to know? Well, in any case, they capture Youssef sometime later, a month or 2 later. And Terry Nichols, he flees back to the United States. Now, when he gets back, his ex-wife says to him, she goes, hey, why are you back so soon? And what he tells her is this: a guy could get killed over there. Now, Richard Clarke, the author of the book Against All Enemies, Richard Clarke, the celebrated, famous Richard Clarke, he says of the Youssef Nichols meeting, he says, when Terry Nichols went to the Philippines, his bombs did not work. When he returned, they were deadly. Check that out, Against All Enemies. What the Filipino police also found in the apartment of Youssef was an inscription from a guy named Nick. Coincidence? Who knows? Oklahoma City is obviously a complex case, so we're going to focus just on one detail that adds clarity to everything, and it's the missing license plate of Timothy McVeigh. Now, the story that McVeigh tells, if it's false, because this is the story also that the prosecutors push, if it's false, it leads us to believe that the FBI and the Clinton Justice Department misdirected the whole case. And if they misdirected this case to avoid its terrorist implications, it's likely they did the same thing with Olympic Park and with TWA Flight 800. Now, McVeigh, fortunately, he told this whole story to 2 Buffalo reporters by the name of Dan Herbeck and Lou Michel, and they retell it in a book called The American Terrorist. And I just want to pick up with McVeigh's story about the license plate, because it speaks to the whole larger issue of whether he's telling the truth. As he tells the story, he drives to Oklahoma City on April 16th, and he drives down in his old yellow Mercury Marquis. He parks a couple blocks away from the Murrah building, and he would later blow up. And there, parks the car, and then he gets this inspiration. He says, what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my license plate off the car, and I'm going to stick it in the back of my pants, which is actually what he tells these guys, right? He sticks it in the back of his pants. And then he says, I did this because what I wanted to do, I had this impish desire to get caught. And then he says, he's telling the story now. I'm going to put some anti-government materials next to my seat, and that way when I get caught leaving Oklahoma City, I can make my grand statement about Waco and about right-wing causes and various things, and everyone will be happy. Now, despite the silliness with the license plate, the person that one meets in The American Terrorist, the Timothy McVeigh that one meets, is a powerful and crafty fellow, a veritable Ubermensch, a Superman capable of doing massive and wonderful things. He tells us that on the morning of April 18th, he goes back to his storage shed in central Kansas by himself, and he's prepared to build by himself and assemble a 7,000-pound truck bomb because Terry Nichols hasn't showed up. So he starts loading stuff. This includes 108 50-pound bags of ammonium nitrate, 400 barrel drums of nitromethane, these crates of highly explosive Tovex sausage, all kinds of spools of shock tubes and wires and all kinds of stuff, and diesel fuel, not to mention the 14 55 barrel drums that he's going to mix all this stuff in, right? He's halfway through this by himself when finally, at least as he tells it, Terry Nichols shows up. Now, the only reason Nichols comes, according to McVeigh, is because he's afraid that McVeigh's going to kill his whole family if he doesn't. So McVeigh is browbeating him to help, and they load the stuff up. And then they go and drive away. This is the morning of the 18th. They drive away to a lake that's nearby, and they start mixing the materials. This is a highly complex and dangerous business. And there's only little holes in the top of the drum, so they've got to funnel this stuff in and mix these perfectly. And then McVeigh, this is a guy, by the way, with no explosives technique, no explosives training. He's not even having any mechanical aptitude that anyone's ever seen before, and yet he devises this whole bomb, and he, as he says, creates a dual fuse system to blow the whole thing up. And they do this all, okay, in 3 hours. They're finished by 11 o'clock in the morning. And it's amazing. When you go back to read about any kind of accident, any kind of incident, the accounts from the first day or two are usually the most reliable. You read the Washington Post for the next few days after Oklahoma City, and they'll tell you that this was an incredibly labor-intensive construction. The FBI is saying this, but McVeigh is saying it. He does it virtually by himself in 3 hours. By 11 o'clock that morning, he's on the road for Oklahoma City. As he tells the story, he crosses the state line into Oklahoma. He pulls up into an anonymous motel, parks alongside it, and goes to sleep for the night. Except by his timeline, it's only 2 p.m. Makes for a long and pointless night. As Timothy McVeigh tells the story, on the morning of April 19th, he alone drives into Oklahoma City in his Ryder truck. He looks around, he sees no one sees him. He lights his dual ignition fuse that he created himself, drives up, parks in front of the Murrah building, he's about ready to get out, and then he remembers, oh yes, I have my large packet of anti-government materials right here that he wants to take with him to have himself exposed. And from there he walks, and then he runs to his Mercury Marquis that he parked a few blocks away. And he puts his anti-government materials in the seat, gets in the Marquis, and then he drives out of town. Now here's where the silly stuff starts. As Michelle and Herbeck tell us in American Terrorist, he drives out of town 2 miles an hour over the speed limit not to call attention to himself. Not only that, but he's careful to observe all signals and all turns and all changes. And you read this and you say, isn't this the same guy who took his license plate off so he'd get caught, so he'd be able to tell his story? It just so happened that a couple years ago, I had lunch in Buffalo with Dan Herbeck, one of the authors. And although it was on another project, I was really burning to ask him this. I said, Dan, why the disparity? How do we account for this? On one page, we have Timothy McVeigh taking his license plate off so he'd get caught. On the next page, we have him driving out of town 2 miles an hour over the speed limit so he won't get caught. Which one is it? And Herbeck tells me, he goes, hey, that's what he told us, and that's what we reported. Well, in her powerful new book called The Third Terrorist, Jana Davis tells another story altogether. Jana Davis at the time was working for KFO4 TV in Oklahoma City, and she was really on the job. In the course of time, she interviewed more than 20 people, credible eyewitnesses, who had seen McVeigh right before and right after that morning in the company of specific Iraqi nationals who were living in Oklahoma City. The story has its roots in the Philippines, and it has its execution right in Oklahoma. And it's an incredible story. Let's pick it up at the Cactus Motel. She has several eyewitnesses, Jana does, who see the Ryder truck pull in on the evening of April 18th, the day before the blast. Not only do they see it, they smell it. You got 7,000 pounds of fertilizer and fuel oil. This has an odor. Several people. On the morning of the 19th, they see, again, we have several credible eyewitnesses who see a convoy leave the Cactus Motel. In that convoy is the Ryder truck, the yellow Mercury Marquis, and also a late model brown pickup. There's McVeigh, and there are several Mid-Eastern-looking men in his company. They leave. Now, they get to Oklahoma City. They get to downtown. Timothy McVeigh pulls into a tire store. With him is another man in the passenger seat, in the Ryder truck. They stop and ask for directions. The people at the tire store give them directions. There are two guys there. They recognize them both later on. In fact, they recognize them and pick them out of a lineup even before they've seen Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh and his passenger drive in the Ryder truck to the Murrah building. There they park. Dana Bradley is in the lobby. She sees a foreign-looking man get outside, that's her word, a foreign-looking man get out of the Ryder truck on the passenger side. and everything in her world goes black. When she wakes up, when she comes to, I should say, rescuers are desperately trying to extricate her from the rubble of the Merah building. And they're doing this by amputating her leg. And she tells them at the time, she says, I saw this Ryder truck, I saw this foreign-looking man, and then everything went black. Well, at that time, even the FBI didn't know about the Ryder truck. This was in the hours after the explosion. Now, she would be testifying in the trial, in McVeigh's trial, and she would tell her story, and the prosecution would undermine her story by pointing out her very real history of emotional problems. But what they could not undermine is the fact that she talked about the Ryder truck before anyone else even knew there was a Ryder truck. Later that day, the FBI recovers the rear axle of the Ryder truck, and they find the vehicle identification number, and they trace it to Eldon Elliott's rental place in the middle of Kansas. They go there the next day, and several people do. They identify McVeigh, and they identify him in the company of a short, dark, Middle Eastern-looking man. This is John Doe number 2. This is where John Doe number 2 enters the world. There are several eyewitnesses there, several of them. This man, John Doe number 2, we've all seen pictures of him. He is now the most hunted fugitive in the history of the world, the most hunted fugitive. Let's get back to that license plate, though, because the license plate clarifies a lot of things. And here we have the testimony of Jerry Nance. Now, Nance works as a printing operator for the Oklahoma City paper. He remembers this experience very well. The next morning, that morning, 5 minutes before the blast, Jerry Nance leaves his building. He's walking to his car. He stops because he sees a guy in a yellow Mercury Marquis. Again, he identifies him as a kind of a short, Mid-Eastern looking guy with a ball cap on. Doesn't think too much of it, but he gets the stuff out of his car. Then he's walking back towards the building, and now this same yellow Mercury Marquis is coming careening out of the parking lot, almost hits him. The Middle Eastern looking man is sitting in the passenger seat now. Behind the steering wheel is a guy who looks all the world like Timothy McVeigh. Nance tells the FBI this before anyone even knows about the Mercury Marquis. And he'll testify to the FBI about this. Let me just read you something here. Again, remember, right after any incident, there's a little truth-telling going on. This is from the Washington Post. The magistrate, Ronald Howland, ordered McVeigh to be held without bail after listening to 4 hours of testimony from FBI Special Agent John Hersley, in which he described eyewitness accounts, it's multiple, of a yellow Mercury Marquis with McVeigh and another man inside speeding away from a parking lot near the federal building. That's John Doe number 2. Now, Nance observed something else. As that car came careening by him, it jumps over a little divider, the license plate swings loose, and now it's dangling from a single bolt. And he recalls it being 118 or 119, and he tells this to the FBI that very day. As to John Doe number 2, most hunted man in the world, you remember him, you've seen his picture. 6 weeks later, he would simply disappear from the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. In the months after the Oklahoma City bombing, Jana Davis at KFO4 TV got into her full Nancy Drew mode. And she began to trace the exit route of Timothy McVeigh at Oklahoma City. And she showed this on TV one night, and she talked about the license plate. And sure enough, a woman who lived along the route, she said, I found this license plate. It's a white Arkansas license plate, the same number that Jerry Nance, the printing operator, had identified on the very day of the crash. Now, Jana Davis theorized that it's much more likely that either the plate just fell off on its own or McVeigh's co-conspirator took the plate off on purpose so that McVeigh, a lily white, would get nabbed with this crime, knowing he was a good soldier and wasn't about to talk. In any case, as soon as the FBI heard about the plate, they seized it. But what they weren't interested in was any of the evidence that Jana Davis had gathered. She had 20 eyewitness interviews. They didn't want to hear any of it. And then you ask yourself, why would they not want to do this? In fact, when they went to trial, there was not one single eyewitness presented who could put Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City or near Oklahoma City on the 19th. They built their case entirely on circumstantial evidence rather than bringing a single eyewitness. And the answer is simple enough, because every single eyewitness saw him with someone else on that morning. Now, the question becomes why? Why would the FBI not be interested? Well, it's not the FBI. Don't blame the FBI. Let's look up further on this chain of command here to the field commander of Oklahoma City, a woman named Jamie Gorelick, who we talked about earlier, and the Clinton Justice Department. The problem is this, and the problem is simple enough. You've got these two perfect specimens of right-wing American manhood. Why look any further? The Democratic National Committee had its talking points. I know something about these points. On the morning of April 19th, 1995, I was co-hosting a radio show in Kansas City, KMBZ, big station. We're on right before Rush Limbaugh. At 9:02 that morning, just when our show was starting, the bomb goes off. We followed it all that morning. We tracked the news closely. Now, my show, I should admit, is one of those yin-yang, point-counterpoint kind of shows. And my partner was this really wily and well-connected Democratic strategist. Now, the first day or two, we, like everyone else, figured, hey, this is Islamic terrorism. There was the APB for the Middle Eastern-looking man, had all the earmarks of Islamic terrorism, all the experts saying Islamic terrorism. And then on day two, they identified Timothy McVeigh as the bomber. They had him do this perp walk. Remember this perp walk? Timothy McVeigh walking through there without a suit on? And this is even before they arrested him. I must tell you how the world reacted. I can tell you how the Democratic world reacted through the eyes of my partner. He was absolutely beside himself with glee. He was gleeful. He was thrilled. We found these two white guys. We could pin the whole thing on the Republican Revolution. And that's just what he did. Next day, you know what he does? He does an APB on the air. He says, we're looking for the co-conspirators, the unindicted co-conspirators of Timothy McVeigh. And their names are Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich. And all across America, people were doing the same thing. Democratic strategists all across America were doing the same thing. Now, Bill Clinton was a little more subtle. He just said, we have to identify the purveyors of hate and division who caused this. His minions, his factotums, filled in the blanks. Those purveyors of hate and division were people like Gordon Liddy and Rush Limbaugh, and of course, Newt Gingrich, whose talk of revolution inspired this whole thing in the first place. The Republican Revolution of 1994 was buried in the rubble of the Murrah Building. Now, Bill Clinton descends on Oklahoma City immediately after the blast, and the one thing he's very good at is strategic grief counseling. He comes to Oklahoma City with a rating in the low 40s. Within a few days, his rating is in the mid-50s, and it never goes under 50 again. His career is saved in the blast of the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City. At the end of his campaign, he would say as much to the reporters who came with him on his campaign tour. As to the Islamic terrorists, well, couldn't really talk about those anymore. In fact, they just kind of disappeared into the woodwork. Let me read something for you from Richard Clark here. He says, could the Al-Qaeda explosive expert have been introduced to the angry American who proclaimed his hatred for America? This is Richard Clark again, talking about Nichols in the Philippines. We do not know, despite some FBI investigation. Some FBI investigation? You'd think there'd be a massive investigation. This is the ultimate link to the Ramzi Youssef cell in the Philippines. And there's some FBI investigation? Here's an interesting excerpt from a Philippine police report that's worth reading. And let me do this for you if you don't mind. It talks about Operation Bojinka, the thing that Youssef was planning in the Philippines, quite possibly with Terry Nichols. The document from Youssef's computer specifically cited the charter service of a commercial-type aircraft loaded with powerful bombs to be dived crash by Saeed Akman. This is apparently intended to demonstrate to the whole world that a Muslim martyr is ready and determined to die for the glorification of Islam. Planes as bombs. Remember that concept. I'm going to repeat this. And the reason you ask yourself is, why then did our security services ignore the likely Islamic terrorist links after Oklahoma City? Well, the reason's simple enough. McVeigh and Nichols were poster boys. Let me repeat this for the Republican Revolution. If they prove to be mere lily whites, that's the phrase they use in the business, that is, white frontmen for an Islamic terrorist plot, they would lose all of their political value. It would become much more corrupt, much less pure. And so from that day forward, Islamic terrorism was swept aside. Not only that, it got worse than that, because I was there and I remember how it was. I remember my partner getting on the air and shaming me, scolding me for daring to profile Mideasterners as the kind of people who do this. They weren't just shaming the right wing, they were shaming all terrorist experts, including guys like Steve Emerson, who after producing Jihad in America for PBS, which was shown once and yanked, he was accused of bigotry and misrepresentation. And from that moment forward, they used this occasion and orchestrated DNC attack on anyone who dared to make this link. Racial profiling, we heard it. Racial profiling, that was the word. So let's not even bother to look. On April 3rd, 1996, Ron Brown and 34 others crashed into a Croatian hillside. All of them died. Ron Brown was the Commerce Secretary of the United States at the time. You know, when I proposed to do a book on this, and I eventually did a book called Ron Brown's Body, I had it in the back of my mind that this too was a terrorist incident. And I thought it was going to fit the whole mega-fix scenario. I mean, they leave Bosnia. This is 6 months after the Dayton Accords. We've just put troops in there. It's an unpopular move. A whole mess of people in that region had a good reason to pull down this plane and undo the Dayton Accords. That's what I thought I'd find out, because I knew there was some mystery surrounding Ron Brown's death. I just didn't know what the mystery was. But when I started the book, I cautioned my publisher. I said, don't expect fireworks at the end. I said, don't expect terrorism, or don't expect murder. I said it'd be certainly irresponsible to talk about murder. I was wrong. What I can tell you is this, is even though it is not terrorism, the scenario is the same. The strategy is the same. You suppress the investigation at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, you suppress the investigation at the Air Force, and then you just create the most advantageous political outcome possible. It just so happens that the plane crash goes down on April 3rd. When it's discovered, it's April 4th. Why? That's the 28th anniversary of Martin Luther King. So Ron Brown is celebrated as creating a mission, just like Martin Luther King's, an important mission of our time. What the people aren't told is that important mission is to broker a sweetheart deal with Enron, right? And the reason that deal is being brokered is to bring in more campaign cash to keep this machinery working for the November 1996 election. Then the story gets really strange. In December 1997, the black media get a hold of the story, and they're hard to suppress. It's easy to suppress the right-wing media, but when the black media pick it up, the story of the hole in the head, it's beginning to make national news. Jesse Jackson gets on board in January 1998. On January 17th, 1998, the Washington Afro-American runs a full-page, front-page story on the hole in the head and the potential murder of Ron Brown. Well, if you remember January 17th, 1998, something else happens. You remember? Bill Clinton gives his deposition in the Paula Jones case, and the word Monica Lewinsky enters the lexicon for the first time ever, right? When that media storm breaks, it just washes away the Ron Brown case. Jesse Jackson gets on board with the president, becomes a spiritual advisor, and a burlesque that would continue for months to come. The story's over, the story's gone, and Ron Brown remains buried. His body, though, still has stories to tell. Bill Clinton had one ally in the Republican-friendly world of the PGA, and that was the shark, Greg Norman, from Australia. Now, the relationship would make the news a year later in a kind of embarrassing way when Bill Clinton, at 1 o'clock in the morning, allegedly tripped coming out of Norman's Florida house and blew out his knee. Now, the rumor that was circulating around Washington, which I kind of like, was that actually Bill Clinton was carrying a naked Monica around Greg Norman's house. I mean, if you can envision Monica, I mean, that could have blown out Superman's knee. That's a major, major blowout. Personally, though, I think that rumor was false. I think a better story that I've heard from a good source is that it was actually a naked anonymous hooker that Bill Clinton was carrying around Greg Norman's house. In any case, he blows out his knee. They're buddies. That goes back a long time. On April 14th, 1996, 4 days after Ron Brown's funeral, Bill Clinton watches in horror as Greg Norman does something that no one's ever done before. Norman takes a 6-stroke lead into the final round of the Masters golf tournament, and he chokes. He blows it. It's the biggest choke in the history of the Masters. Bill Clinton is horrified. He's beside himself because he's thinking choke himself. He's desperately afraid that he's going to blow this election. He's scrambled back now. This is 1996, 16 months after November 94. No one can believe how far he's come back. At one point, he was down to Bob Dole by 20 points in the polls, and now he's ahead of Bob Dole. And the last thing he wants to do is to blow this. He's just desperately afraid of blowing it. So he makes a tape of the final 4 holes. He distributes to his key campaign staff, and he says, under no circumstance will our campaign be Greg Normanized. And at all key moments thereafter, he whispers into the ears of his staff, Greg Norman, Greg Norman, Greg Norman. Because Bill Clinton knows something that his staff does not know, that Dick Morris doesn't know, that no one knows, probably beside Hillary, and that is with the death of Ron Brown, they avoided a serious Greg Norman moment. Because what precipitated Brown's revolt against the White House was the fear that his son Michael was going to prison. Brown went to see Clinton about 6 weeks before the crash and said, under no circumstance can Michael go to prison. If he goes, I talk. I talk about Asia. I talk about money. I talk about treason. I talk about the People's Republican Army and where our money is coming from. Whether that led to the trip, I do not know. But on April 14th, 1996, Bill Clinton had Greg Norman on his mind. In the summer of '96, one reason that Bill Clinton feared the Greg Norman moment was because he realized, as he had in the words of the indiscreet Dick Morris, a soft underbelly. And that soft underbelly was that people, even though they were prepared to vote for him, didn't really like him and certainly didn't trust him, particularly in his role as commander-in-chief. He was afraid of a major crisis going wrong on him in a desperate way. He didn't need a crisis. He had a cakewalk into the election. But that summer, the summer of 1996, presented some problems. Dick Morris identifies that summer as the terror summer of 1996, and he describes 3 attacks, and that's the word he used, attacks, that would mark that summer. Remember that word, attacks. The first occurs on June 25th, 1996, when a truck bomb, much like the one in Oklahoma City, goes off outside the Khobar Towers, an American Army barracks. 19 Americans are killed, hundreds more are wounded. Okay, in that the Khobar Towers is in Saudi Arabia, even the media can't blame Rush Limbaugh this time, or Newt Gingrich, or the NRA. I mean, this is Islamic terrorism. There's no way around it. So what do? Well, you poll. You run some polls. And Dick Morris comes back to the president and he says, okay, what you got to do is talk tough. I think talking tough will do. Here's what the president has to say, and this is worth reading here. The cowards who committed this murderous act must not go unpunished. Let me say again, we will pursue this. America takes care of our own. Those who did it must not go unpunished. Well, the next day, Morris is still polling. He decides to weigh in again. And he is very clear this time. Let me be very clear. We will not resist. He didn't mean to say resist. He corrects himself. We will not rest in our efforts to find who is responsible for this outrage, to pursue them, and to punish them, okay? Now, Morris continues to poll. He's trying to track how this is working. Remember, we're leading up to an election here that he can't afford to blow. Greg Norman, Greg Norman, Greg Norman. So Morris comes back to him and he has a meeting and he shares his agenda. And this needs to be read because it's just too beautiful. He goes, whenever there is a crisis, says Morris, I ordered an immediate poll. I was concerned about how Clinton looked in the face of the attack and whether the people blamed him. Here's what the poll results were. Saudi bombing. Recovered from Friday and looking great. Approved Clinton handling 73-20. Big gain from 63-20 on Friday. Security was adequate, 52-40. Bottom line, it's not Clinton's fault, 76-18. That's the state of security in the summer of 1996. Now, they couldn't make this go away. They couldn't say it was the militia movement of Idaho that blew up these barracks in Saudi Arabia, so they simply ignored it. Just like with the First World Trade Center bombing, they handed it off to police work, right? They handed it off to the FBI. This is in Saudi Arabia, an attack on a military barracks, and the FBI is supposed to solve the case. Instead, this time, instead of merely ignoring the case, the Clinton administration actually interferes with Louis Freeh. Now, Freeh is sometimes ineffectual, but in this case, he's really trying hard. He wants to solve the case, and years are going by, and he's not getting any help. Finally, in desperation, he quietly goes to the senior George Bush and says, "Can you intervene with the Saudis and get me some information on this?" And he does it quietly, and he gets the information, and Freeh decides to stick it out, even beyond Clinton's leaving the White House, just to break this case. And finally, in 2001, the new Attorney General, John Ashcroft, picks up the burden and indicts 14 Saudis. This is 5 years later. Bill Clinton's been elected. Oh, he can be elected. Okay, let's jump ahead now. It's July 17th, 1996. A beautiful night, 71 degrees. Ramzi Youssef was on trial that day in New York City. A lot going on. In fact, on the East Coast, reportedly, it was the highest state of military alert since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and with good reason. It's 2 days before the Olympics, 3 weeks after Khobar Towers. Serious threat had come in the night before, promising a major act against the foolish American president and his minions in America. No wonder people were on alert. Richard Clarke among them. This is the same Richard Clarke who wrote Against All Enemies. We pick up the story from Richard Clarke's point of view. Now, I could talk to you for hours about 800 alone, but I'm going to tell you what Clarke says, because in his book, he gives away the game. In his book, Against All Enemies, he tells us things that we never knew before, and it's brilliant to behold. In any case, Clarke devises, as he tells us, the ultimate exit strategy from the whole Flight 800 morass. An exit strategy is the word these guys use. They had to get out of this, and it wasn't easy. And the strategy that Clarke and his colleagues come up with is just brilliant in its conception. It was ruthless in its execution, and it was dishonest in just about every detail. And you don't have to subscribe to a particular theory about what happened in 800 to know that the one that Clarke is handing us is total BS. But anyhow, let's pick up with what he tells us. He's driving in to Washington, into the White House, to the Situation Room. It's 9 o'clock that night, the 17th. It's a half hour after the crash. And as he's driving in, he's worried because he knows that the ramifications of this are. By the way, there was a value jet crash 2 months earlier. There was no meeting in the Situation Room after that. Why he's driving in now? Well, let's find out. He tells us that when he gets there, he's confronted by the FAA. And the FAA tells him this. They said, we had it on our radar screen. Flight 800 ascended up to 17,000 feet. And then it just disappeared, and we don't know what happened. This is what he tells us. Well, Clarke is lying to us on 2 scores. The first one is this. The FAA called the meeting. They knew what happened. What happened is this, is their radar operators in New York saw an unknown object merging on the screen with Flight 800 in the second before it blew up, and then it disappeared from the screen. This is what prompted the meeting. In their own documents, they said, we called the White House immediately. That call went to Richard Clarke. That's why he's driving in there. Ron Schleid of the NTSB says, holy Christ, this looks terrible, the first time he saw that radar data. He said, it looks like something turned and overtook the plane. This is all documented. This is what the meeting was about. Second lie is this. Clarke tells us that the plane was at 17,000 feet when it off the radar screens. In fact, it was at 13,700 feet when it disappeared from the screens. Why does he raise it 3,300 extra feet? Because at 17,000 feet, it's beyond the reach of all shoulder-fired missiles. Now, there's something else Clarke doesn't want to talk about, and that is the 750 eyewitnesses off the coast of Long Island who watched, as they describe it, objects zigzag off the horizon, flaming objects, red burning tips, white smoky contrails, arcing over, disappearing, and then exploding, white blast, exploding, white blast, exploding, big yellow fireball, falling into the sea. Now, many of these eyewitnesses left drawings so specific and chilling they could just make your blood curl. Here's one from a high school principal in a West Hampton parking lot. His number is 649.
He reports seeing an object like a firework ascend fairly quick, then slow and wiggle, then speed up and disappear. Then he sees a second object that glimmered in the sky higher than the first, then a red dot move up to that object, then a puff of smoke, then another puff, then a firebox.
The eyewitness illustrations aren't the only thing missing from Clark's book. Also missing is any talk of satellite data. Now, according to one family member I spoke to, there are at least 3 satellites floating above the East Coast that night who could see just about anything. He was told by a member of the NTSB that all 3 at that time just happened to be broken. Now, we know how capable these satellites are by what happened in October of 2001. I don't know if you remember this incident, but this is just 3 weeks after September 11th, and the world's a little jittery. A Russian airliner is flying over the Black Sea at 30,000 feet, and then all of a sudden a missile comes up and blows it out of the sky, and no one knows where it came from. Well, within 5 minutes, our Department of Defense was online with the Russians, telling them that it was a Ukrainian missile that misfired and popped that plane right out of the sky, and they were correct. 5 minutes, that's all it took. Well, on the night of July 17th, 1996, there was no satellite data, certainly not in the Situation Room, where Richard Clark and all the other members, the FBI and other part of the terrorist task force were located. If there were satellite data, and I surely believe there was, it was in the family quarters with our president. He never left the family quarters that night. He, I suspect, knew exactly what happened that night, exactly when it happened. If there was satellite data, it was up there. I've talked to Colonel Buzz Patterson. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty. That night, Colonel Patterson was on duty in the White House. His job was a pretty high security job. He carried the nuclear football for the president. It doesn't get much higher security than that. He tells me that that night the president never left the family quarters. His job usually was to run data from the Situation Room to the family quarters, but that night he was kept out of the loop fully. In his book, he tells an intriguing story. Sometime after July 17th, he's not sure of the exact date, but it was late summer, that same summer, he's in the process of picking up some reports from the desk of the president and taking them back to the National Security Council. He looks at the reports, he sees there's notations all across the reports. And he looks down and catches his attention because he's a pilot, Air Force pilot, and he sees it's about a plan called Operation Bojinka. And in the plan, he sees how their plan is, one part of their plan is to take commercial airliners, hijack them, and use them as bombs, and to attack American targets. This catches his attention, as you can well imagine it would. And he puts it back, but he knows it's there. Now, Richard Clark doesn't talk about Colonel Patterson, but in his book, Clark reveals, and I hate to use this word, but what a total suck-up the man is. He flies with the Clintons to Long Island a week after the crash for some more strategic grief counseling, which the president is very good at. The families are all there, and through Clark's eyes, and he tells us how he's sitting with the president and the first lady on Air Force One, and he's telling them about the new anti-terrorist plans they're going to have, and he can talk to the families about them and share them with the families and score some more points in the polls. This is still running up to the election. We don't want a Greg Norman moment here. We don't want to make this a Greg Norman moment. Now, at this time, Clark tells us too that he and the president are still convinced that it's terrorism. Well, the president knows what it is. Clark probably doesn't really even know. We go to Long Island. We meet with the families. The president's out there hugging them and kissing them and embracing them, probably goosing them a little bit here and there. And Clark is just agog at the president's skills. And then in the great moment, he walks by and he sees Hillary. And he describes her alone in a chapel, praying on her knees. So says Richard Clark. Now, we've heard a lot about women being on their knees in the White House, but this is the first time we've heard about Hillary. Now, the very day that Richard Clark flies up to New York with the Clintons, another fellow is on patrol that day as well. His name is Richard Jewell. You may have heard of him. Security guard working in Atlanta. A little Barney Fife-ish, but a good guy, working hard, trying to do the right thing, very concerned about terrorism at the Atlanta Olympics where he's working in Centennial Park, and well, he should be. There's a lot to be concerned about. In fact, a few weeks earlier, Richard Clarke himself had gone down to Atlanta to plan for the possible terrorist strikes. This is in the summer of '96, the summer of terror, as Dick Morris called it. The summer of the almost war of '96, as Clarke himself tells it. There's a lot to be worried about. What's fascinating about Clarke's account is how he talks about, he brags about, he boasts about, his book is filled with boasts. He boasts about how he was in this meeting with all these various terrorist experts in Atlanta, and he raised the possibility of a hijacked 747 being flown into the Olympic Stadium and killing thousands of people. And everyone dismissed it as, but not Richard Clarke, because he had the foresight to think of that as a possibility. So Islamic terrorism was much on everyone's mind. I mean, no one was going to accuse even the Idaho militia of hijacking a 747. Well, Richard Jewell is patrolling that night. Now it's after midnight into the next day, and he spots under a bench an Alice pack. It's what it's called. It's kind of a military pack, and it's alone and untended. And he does the right thing. The first thing he does is he calls the guy from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and says, hey, there's an untended pack here. He is that way. That's the way Jewell was. And then, he continues to look around, and the guy from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation comes, and he can't find anyone. And then they start clearing an area around the bench. They clear it away so that people aren't going to be affected, just in case it is a bomb. No one really expected it would be. Jewell goes up into the control towers, and he warns the technicians there. He says, better clear out, better clear out. Well, sure enough, about an hour after Jewell spots it, the bomb goes off. Fortunately, the bomb had been jostled, and so its explosive power was less than it might have been. But this is a 40-pound bomb. This is a serious bomb. It could have killed hundreds. As it was, 2 people die and 112 are wounded. And for a day, Richard Jewell is something of a hero. He's the guy who found the bomb. Had he not, no telling how many people would have been killed. The heroism doesn't last long. The Clinton Justice Department, after failing to be able to pin this on a drunk in a bar who made a threat sometime before, pin who else but Richard Jewell. All talk of Islamic terrorism goes away. I mean, you could read the accounts of that time and you'd be astonished how bad they are. There's no mention of even the possibility. The single best account, 18,000 words. In Vanity Fair, the words Islamic or Islam do not even appear as a possibility. Now, for the next several months, Richard Jewell, this poor security guard living at home with his mom, hounded by the media like he was the Unabomber, lives through an incredible hell. They finally release him as a suspect in late October when the election is wrapped up. But he served his purpose. He was just a wonderful diversion from the real possibilities of who planted this. Now, okay, people are still dead, and Richard Jewell's not the guy, so we've got to figure out someone, right? 6 months later, a bomb goes off outside an abortion clinic in Atlanta. A month after that, another bomb goes outside the Other Side Lounge. It's a gay bar in Atlanta. And now they figure, it must be some right-winger. They don't like the Olympics, they don't like gay bars, they don't like abortion. It had to be some right-winger, and they chase Eric Rudolph off. Who knows? He may even be guilty. I don't know. But I do know this, is that they didn't even look towards the obvious. The jihad in America really began in 1990, in November of 1990. This is not discussed much, but this was the first real strike, the first murder in the American jihad. An Egyptian guy by the name of Al-Sayed Nasser goes to Manhattan, a hotel room, and he shoots and kills Meir Kahan, who's a Jewish activist. He flees, he's caught. That was the first killing in the American jihad. The first attack in the American jihad came 6 months before that. Same guy, Sayed Nasser, Egyptian. You know what he does? You know what he blows up? A gay bar in Greenwich Village. And this is the great irony of this whole progressive embrace of Islam, of radical Islam. The America that these people hate is progressive America. It's the America of gay bars, of abortion clinics, of radical feminism. It's the America of Janet Jackson and Michael Jackson and Tito Jackson and Marlon Jackson and Jermaine Jackson and Jackson Brown and Jackson Pollock. It's progressive America that they're rebelling against. And yet, Our progressive friends can't embrace them tightly enough. And there's one reason why. They have something in common. And it's the bottom line. It's unpleasant, but it's true. They both hate America. One final irony. Towards the end of the election, the China fundraising scandal is beginning to nip at Bill Clinton's butt. And he's very defensive about it, as you might imagine he could be. He's afraid of the Greg Norman moment. He's afraid they're going to reveal everything and blow the election. So what he does, when he's talking to the media, he compares himself, both in terms of his innocence and in terms of the way he's been hounded, to a certain figure who's been in the media for the last several months. And that figure just happens to be Richard Jewell. Bill Clinton compares himself to Richard Jewell. You want a comparison? Think how the media would react in this era if, after the prison abuse scandal at Abu whatever, George Bush said, in the abuse that he's received from the media, he identifies with the prisoners at the jail. He'd get laughed off. He'd get laughed off. He'd get laughed off the entire planet. That's how strange it was in 1996. The almost war, the terror summer, the Greg Norman moment, all coming to fruition. 4 weeks after the crash of TWA Flight 800, now we're sometime in the middle of August, based on Richard Clarke's own kind of rough timeline, Clarke goes up to Long Island to visit the site of the investigation, the Calverton hangar. There he's walking through, according to his own account, and he comes across an anonymous technician, unknown technician. And he says to him, "Hey, is that where the bomb went off?" And the technician says, and by the way, this is a very close paraphrase of what Clarke says in his book. He has a word-for-word account. The technician says to him, "Well, this is where the explosion was, but it wasn't exactly a bomb. We're here on row 23, just in the forward part of the compartment. But if you look carefully, look at the gaseous effusion and the pitting and the tearing, it's not exactly a bomb." Clarke says to him, "Well, if it's not a bomb, then what is it?" Technician says, "Well, this is where the center fuel tank is, and based on my estimation, it was the center fuel tank that blew up and it caused all the problems." And Clarke says, "My gosh, I didn't know that." And conversation is just astonishing to see when you come across in the book. Someone faxed me the relevant pages and made my jaw drop when I read it. Pride goeth here before the fall. What Clarke is doing, he's taking credit for the exit strategy, or what some of us might call the cover-up, months before the NTSB even discovers this, right? Clarke is filled with himself. He goes back to Washington, at least in his retelling. He flies back to Washington that night, and he confronts Tony Lake, who's the head of the NSA, and Leon Panetta, the chief of staff. And he says to them, he draws them a diagram of the 747, shows them where the fuel tank is, shows them where this bomb, this gaseous diffusion was. He tells them how the technician had told him that the theory was, he goes, "Hey, listen, the tank was half full. It was overheated possibly, some faulty wiring from a fuel pump, and then bang, the whole thing goes off." And Tony Lake looks at him and says, "Well, does the NTSB believe this?" And Clarke's two-word response, based on his own account, is priceless. Clarke tells Tony Lake, "Not yet." Everything was wrong. He misnames the fuel tank. It's the center wing tank, not the center line fuel tank. It's not half full, it's empty. The wiring is outside the fuel tank. It's not inside. All the pumps have been found, and they were found blameless. It wasn't overheated. It was 71 degrees at night. It was a cool summer night. Everything is wrong. But this is a useful story because at this time, we're heading into the election. Something's got to give here. At that same time, and this is curious, the FBI is leaking daily to the New York Times, speaking exclusively to the New York Times, but leaking to them. And every day they're telling them more and more about signs of explosive residue found all over the plane, tested and retested in Washington, particularly PETN, which is found both in bombs and missiles. It's all over the right side of the plane, right around seat 23, as a matter of fact, where Richard Clarke is alleged to have found the fuel tank explosion. Now, Jim Kallstrom of the FBI has been a good soldier to this point. He's kept out of the news, purposefully kept out of the news, probably just not to scare the American public. He's kept out the news all talk of satellites, all talk of eyewitnesses, all talk of radar data, all talk of military, all talk of just about anything that could point to missiles. But he has been marching inexorably towards a terrorist scenario, and something's got to give. What gives is the FBI. On August 22nd, Jamie Gorelick, remember her, the 9/11 commissioner, summons Jim Kallstrom of the FBI to a meeting in Washington. This is a come-to-Jesus meeting. And I don't know what happened in that meeting. I imagine that Gorelick told Kallstrom something like the truth, and the truth would have been this. Hey, if you continue to talk about terror, we're going to have to go to war. And we don't even know who we're going to go to war against. And it could cause a huge international disruption. So let's suppress this talk. Kallstrom is a real soldier. He's a real bulldog. And he had to have heard some kind of national security message to silence him, because he does. The next day, all behavior changes. It's a particularly problematic day for Kallstrom because he's already leaked to the New York Times the headline story, prime evidence found that explosive device in cabin destroys TWA Flight 800. Above the fold right, New York Times. Above the fold left, Bill Clinton signs welfare reform bill on eve of Democratic National Convention. We could not have these dueling headlines. This headline had to go, and it went. The TWA Flight 800 comedy, such as it was, picks up in September 1996. On September 9th, Al Gore, who's the chairman of the Safety and Security Commission, who was appointed in the wake of the crash, comes forth with a series of tough recommendations, the kind that we really got after September 11th for real. Now, the airline industry, when they saw these recommendations, realized that if actually executed, they would probably destroy the industry, certainly its profit margins. And so they protested. And this being an election season and they needing campaign cash, on September 19th, Al Gore writes back to Carol Hallett, the chief lobbyist, and says, don't worry about these recommendations. They're really just kind of paper. You'll have a chance to interact with them, and don't worry about it too much. Well, as if to make sense of all this, on September 20th, Jim Hall, who's described as a family retainer for the Gore family, now chairman of the NTSB, the Washington Post in an arch moment described him as having as his best qualification a driver's license. He replaced on the NTSB a guy with a degree in, a PhD degree for that matter, in astrophysics from Princeton University. He gets involved for the first time in the investigation. He calls down to Washington, both the Washington Post and the New York Times. And he tells them, despite all you've read in the New York Times about explosive residue found all over the plane, and despite what you might have known about witnesses and all that sort of stuff, and people seeing things zigzagging into the sky, we've decided it's a mechanical failure that destroyed TWA Flight 800. Now, a month earlier, they were saying that this was an entirely remote possibility. There was a mechanical failure. But now they decided. And they admit that we don't have any evidence of what that mechanical failure is, but we're pretty sure it is a mechanical failure. Obviously, Jim Hall hadn't talked to Richard Clark yet, hadn't shared with him his theory of the exploding fuel tank, but that would come. Now, when they heard this, the media were a little confused. They said, how do we deal with all the explosive residue that's found all over the plane? Well, they didn't have to wait long. The next day, literally the next day, September 21st, the story is broken that the FBI, after this exhaustive search all over the world, finally discovered that a plane, the Flight 800 plane, had been in St. Louis 5 weeks before the crash. And on that day, an African-American police officer and his silly dog, Carlo, had done a careless and reckless dog training exercise using real explosives, and they spilled the explosives all over the plane. And that's the source of the explosive residue. Now, they broke this story without speaking to the pilots, without even speaking to the officer in charge, but the media could have cared less. This was their ultimate red herring, and they went yapping after like a bunch of hounds. Yeah, we buy this. End of investigation. The story dies on September 21st, 1996. I guess that accounts for all the explosive residue. Well, I did something no one else in the media had done. I called the cop. There's a police officer in St. Louis. It's not hard to find. I said to him, hey, tell me about what happened with this dog training exercise. First words out of his mouth, you know what they are? I am still pissed off to this day by what they did to me. Now, we and our colleagues, we also talked to the pilots. We reviewed the records. We looked at everything they had, and the case was simple enough to uncover. The only record that this cop kept was his time. He didn't mark down the tail number, the gate number, anything else about the plane. He just said wide body and the time. At the time he was doing this investigation on board an empty airliner, because that's the only environment he could do it in, at the time he was doing this training, the TWA Flight 800 plane, the plane that would become TWA Flight 800, was on its way to Hawaii with 400 people on board. Sitting next to it at the gate was an empty 747 where undoubtedly this training exercise took place. We talked to the pilots too. They had never seen a dog training exercise on board their plane. This is totally fabrication. And the story ended right there. That's how easy it was. That's how easy the mega fix was 6 weeks before the election. 6 weeks before the election, checks start rolling in from the airline industry. Total of $650,000 in all before our election was over. Remember that number, because it's going to come back to haunt Al Gore. But there was, however, one bit of evidence that the Clintons couldn't make go away. I mean, they could lose, conceal, corrupt every other bit of evidence, just like they did in Oklahoma City. They could silence the critics. 2 people were arrested, 2 others were suspended from within the investigation who tried to come forward. You remember, in 1996, the media didn't like whistleblowers. I mean, think about whistleblowers. Who? Paula Jones, Gary Aldrich, Linda Tripp. Ask her what it's like to be a whistleblower in that era. She's a pariah. But the one bit of evidence they could not make go away were the eyewitnesses on Long Island. This is Long Island. This is the Hamptons. These people are used to being taken seriously. These are engineers and pilots and fishermen and vacationers in million-dollar homes. And they're not used to having their intelligence insulted. And they insist on going forward. And then, who pops up once more, at least in his retelling? He proves his ingenuity once again. There's a barrier that exists between the FBI and the CIA. Not anymore, not with Richard Clarke involved. All evidence points to him as the man who breaks down this barrier to create the animation that follows.
Using these eyewitness reports and radar tracking data, CIA analysts were able to reconstruct the approximate path of Flight 800 from the instant its recordings ended until it struck the water. The following sequence of events is based on that analysis. Just after the aircraft exploded, it pitched up abruptly and climbed several thousand feet from its last recorded altitude of about 13,800 feet to a maximum altitude of about 17,000 feet. This is consistent with information provided by NTSB investigators and Boeing engineers.
To be fair, Boeing, as soon as it saw this video animation, disowned it absolutely, denied that it had any involvement in the creation of it. And Richard Clarke himself is a little bit discreet about it because, after all, we're talking about the most egregious bit of dissembling in the peacetime history of the United States. Still, if you read his book carefully, he was deeply involved with it, and it's unlikely that anyone else could have bridged that famous wall between the FBI and the CIA. But the guys at the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, the rank and file guys, they all thought it was really hogwash. And for 2 years, they persisted in asking for an interview with the CIA. They wanted to talk to the analyst and figure out how he could make this transform what appeared to be a missile into a plane in crippled flight, a theory that Richard Clarke himself backed. And what they told him, finally, under questioning, under grilling, the CIA finally admitted that of the 750 eyewitnesses, they based this animation on the testimony of one witness, the man on the bridge, a mechanic from Philadelphia by the name of Mike Wire.
Calculations based on the flight path of Flight 800 with respect to this eyewitness show that when the aircraft exploded, it was just passing over the house above which the white light first appeared. So the white light saw very likely was the aircraft briefly ascending and arching over after it exploded, rather than a missile attacking the aircraft.
My partner Jim Sanders finally caught up with Mike Wire, and that's kind of a funny story in itself because he had a common noun for a name, Wire. And in one case, the FBI forgot to capitalize it. Someone forgot to redact it, and we found his name. We got to him, and we asked him to explain to us what he saw from the bridge. This is something the FBI never did. Here's what Mike Wire told us, and here's what the FBI recorded in his initial and true witness statement called a 302.
And I saw what looked like cheap fireworks leaving the beach behind this flat-roofed house. It went out on an angle, and then it turned and went out to sea. Now, as it was flying, it wavered back and forth and up and down. And I thought it must be cheap fireworks because it didn't go like a fireworks would straight away. It kind of wavered as it was in flight. It had a white glow to it and like a white plume, little white plume behind it. Went out to sea and it arced over and then disappeared. And after it disappeared, then a big orange fireball erupted in the sky.
Okay, we've got two versions in hand here. Now, if you recall, the CIA animation has a little teeny blip going up offshore about 10 miles at about 80 degrees. Mike Wire has a 40-degree blip going up this way, not a blip, it's a streak with a contrail, out and away from shore. How do you reconcile these two? Even more importantly, how do you reconcile that zigzag? Where's the zigzag in the clip? Another thing, and this is critical, where is this streak coming from? In his retelling, Mike Wire says it comes off the beach and it goes up and away. In the CIA version, it starts about 20 degrees above the horizon, right where TWA Flight 800 would have been. Now this is critical. There's a lot depends on what happens next. The guys from the NTSB, when they were questioning the CIA, they caught wind of this. They saw the discrepancy. They said, how do you reconcile these two? Well, here's what the CIA analyst told them. This, by the way, is recorded. It is, I think, the most intriguing piece of documentation in the whole vast Flight 800 library. And here's what they say to the NTSB guys. They say, you know, when we first saw Mike Wire's witness statement, we saw that it said this object came up off the beach, off the horizon. And when we saw that, we realized that if the object he had seen had actually ascended off the horizon, what he saw could not be Flight 800 in crippled flight, but something entirely different, like a missile. So what we did, says the CIA analyst, we told the FBI to go back and re-interview Mike Wire. And when the FBI went back to re-interview him, he said to them, no, you're right, come to think of it, what I saw when I first saw it was in the sky about 20 degrees above the horizon, right where TWA Flight 800 would have been. Now here's a direct quote from the CIA analyst. He goes, when we saw that second interview with Wire, we became much more comfortable with our theory. Now remember, they based their animation almost exclusively on Wire's testimony. Well, when we finally caught up with Mike Wire, we asked him a simple question. Mike, when the FBI went back to interview you that second time, why'd you change your story? You know what Mike Wire told us? What second time? The FBI only talked to me in July of '96. They never came back to talk to me. He told us exactly what was on his witness statement to 302. They were perfectly in sync. He never changed it. There is no second 302. I've seen his file. Other people have been interviewed twice, have a second 302, not Mike Wire. Follow me here. The single most important piece of evidence in the TWA Flight 800 investigation, that is the second witness statement from Mike Wire, the man upon whom the CIA based this animation, the animation that discredited all 270 other witnesses to a missile, the animation that Richard Clark most likely engineered, was based entirely on a manufactured witness. It didn't happen. This interview never took place. This is clearly obstruction of justice, and I'm willing to say it on the screen. A lot hinged on this, just about everything. As for the motive for this exit strategy, the words they use to get out of the whole Flight 800 mess, Richard Clark provides that as well. You see, after Khobar Towers, 3 weeks before Flight 800, the president, according to Clark, decided that we had to have, quote, a massive retaliation against Iran if they ever attacked us again. This they call the Eisenhower option. Clark tells us that he was driving in that night, the night that he first heard about TWA Flight 800, he was dreading this, that they would have to go into the Eisenhower option. He tells us when he first discovered the fuel tank theory, how encouraged they all were because that meant they could evade this. Now, for reasons of national security, it may be legitimate to avoid a war with a country you're not even sure is guilty. It could have been Iraq just as well, certainly state-sponsored. But that's not their motive here. Clark's motive, and he's a political man, is political. Remember that Richard Clark describes this whole chapter, and this includes the Olympic Park bombing, as the almost war of 1996. He doesn't want to go to war. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons not to want to go to war, But for the Clinton White House, that reason is the Greg Norman factor. You have this election locked up. Why blow it now? Especially when the public doesn't trust you and you don't even trust yourself to be commander-in-chief. No, this was all about politics. The Clintons had learned how easy it all was in Oklahoma City. All you got to do is lose and corrupt the evidence and make the eyewitnesses go away. That's the hard part. But the media is compliant. They're complicit. They don't want you to lose either. And this is critical. When our founding fathers wrote our Constitution, they wrote it around the fallibility of elected leaders. What they did not count on was the cravenness of our media. The New York Times, leading up to Flight 800, and that whole month, 2 months afterwards, you know how many of the eyewitnesses they interviewed? 270 eyewitnesses see something streaking upwards toward that plane. The New York Times interviews 0 of them. They don't even acknowledge it, not one. And the other media all followed the New York Times. It was really a pitiful performance. And at the end of the day, here's what we're asked to believe. We're asked to believe that those 270 people on Long Island all suffered optical illusions. We're asked to believe that the explosive residue found all over the plane was because of a sloppy dog training exercise. We're asked to believe that that radar that precipitated this whole thing in the first place, the FAA radar, was because of a computer glitch. Actually, they offered 5 different explanations for what that could have been. And at the end of the day, the American people are asked to believe that for the first time in the 75-year history of commercial aviation, when all these optical illusions are going on, a plane self-destructs because of a fuel tank problem. And the tragedy is we believed it. This whole unseemly charade came to an end on September 11th, 2001. I don't need to tell you what happened that day, but I'll just tell you its consequences. Yosef Bodansky, the head of the Congressional Office of Counterterrorism, had written in 1999 in his book on bin Laden, by denying their terrorists their due for TWA Flight 800, we assured that the next time they struck New York, they would do so in a way that no one could deny. On September 11th, when those planes flew in, even the most cynical of Washington observers wasn't about to blame Richard Jewell. This was serious business. On September 11, 2001, John Kerry appeared that night on the Larry King Show. Kerry, by the way, had been on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 1996 when TWA Flight 800 blew up. And Kerry started reciting a whole litany of terrorist incidents that had led to this and things about which we should have been much more careful. He talked about the Achille Lauro and Nicole and the Khobar Towers and the bombing in Riyadh and the first World Trade Center bombing and TWA Flight 800. TWA Flight 800. I wasn't watching the show that night. Larry King missed it, just went right on by. But I heard from several people who called him immediately, called Kerry's office. They said, are you telling us that TWA Flight 800 was a terrorist act? Well, his office made up some, you must have misunderstood, blah, 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 blah. So, that passed. On September 24th, 2001, I'm watching Hardball with Chris Matthews. John Kerry's on again. John Kerry starts his litany again. Achille Lauro, USS Cole, Khobar Towers, Riyadh, TWA Flight 800. He listed among the terrorist acts. I nearly came out of my chair. I got the transcript from Larry King. There was no mistake. I heard this. There was no mistake. On September 20th, 2001, in between these two events, one mainstream newspaper in America broke the story about how Al Gore, 5 years earlier, had sold out the Safety and Security Commission for the sake of campaign cash. You want to guess what newspaper that was? Remember, we got Kerry on the 11th, Kerry on the 24th, talking about TWA Flight 800 as acts of terrorism, and on the 20th, one newspaper pins this all on Al Gore. Guess. How about the Boston Globe, John Kerry's hometown newspaper? This was John Kerry's shot across Al Gore's bow. At the time, Al Gore was the only person who stood between him and the nomination for president, the Democratic ticket. We wrote about this in our book, First Strike, Jim Sanders and I. 2 weeks after that book's advance copies hit Washington, Al Gore surprisingly drops out of the race. I don't know that it was because of the book, but I wouldn't be surprised. They play hardball in those primaries. Al Gore, after all, was the guy who introduced Willie Horton when he ran against Michael Dukakis in 1988. These guys play for real. They play for keeps. Unfortunately, they don't take our national security as importantly as they take their own elections. Let's jump ahead now. 2004, it's the 9/11 Commission hearings. Jamie Gorelick on the panel. Remember, I objected. Not that anyone listened. Condoleezza Rice, is testifying. Head of the NSA under George W. The first question she's asked by anyone is this: has anyone, CIA, FBI, anyone, told you about the possibility of using planes as bombs before September 11th? You know what she answered? No. She was telling the truth. A few days earlier, Richard Clark had testified himself, and he had admitted the same thing. He said, we talked about this 5 or 6 years ago, planes as bombs, but then we kind of let it drop. Remember him several years earlier boasting about how he predicted that a 747 could fly into the Olympic Stadium and kill thousands. Let's go back even before that to the Oklahoma City and Nichols' potential involvement with the Bojinka plot and Ramzi Youssef. Remember too, Colonel Buzz Patterson picking up those plans off the president's desk about Bojinka, about the use of planes as bombs. Why did this all go away? Well, I think there's one good reason why, and it's the 600,000-pound gorilla in the 9/11 Commission room. That 600,000-pound gorilla is TWA Flight 800. The single best scenario for what happened that night is this: that those were U.S. Navy missiles firing at a terrorist airplane filled with high-energy explosives, attacking TWA Flight 800. Those missiles, we believe, blew the plane up. Now, you don't have to buy that theory to know that missiles were fired that night. Someone fired them. This was a terrorist incident. If Clark had talked about this, he'd have to uncover everything he knew about TWA Flight 800. And we couldn't have that happen. Right, Norman, right, Norman, right, Norman. Apparently they filmed a second ending for the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. If you recall, early on, Dr. Miles Bennell, escaping town, communist, soulless people chasing him, runs into the street, stop, stop, stop. You've got to listen, you've got to hear me. Well, in the original version of the movie, that's where the movie ends. Pretty gloomy end. So what they did, this being Hollywood, they went back and they reshot a beginning and an end. And in the beginning, in the version that eventually made it to the movie screens, we first meet Dr. Miles Bennell in a psych ward where he's been taken from the highway. And he starts telling them the story about the seed pods, and then we see the whole story. And then at the end, the doctor's skeptical, they're looking at him, they're listening, they don't believe him, they're getting ready to straitjackets, they're getting ready to take him away, when all of a sudden, and a new emergency comes into the hospital. A guy's being wheeled in, victim of a truck accident. Stops and talks to the doctor. Says, strangest thing, this truck overturned and all these giant seed pods came spilling out onto the highway. And the doctor stood up and said, call the police, call the military. And the audience, me included, said, the situation will be saved. I like that second ending. I'm an optimist. I believe that the situation will be saved. I believe that you will make it happen. So get out there, spread the word, tell the truth, keep the faith.